So we're once again playing as the 1st Tyneside Scots, with a full complement of companies A, B, C, and in reserve D. Each company is made up of 3 platoons, and each platoon is made up of 1 officer and 35 enlisted, giving us 108 bayonets to a company and 432 to the battalion. It's interesting to note the composition of our force. Looking at just the on-map battalion strength of 652, around a third are dedicated to support roles. This proportion increases when we factor in the machine gun platoon, off-map signallers, quartermasters and truck drivers, giving just a little insight into the Allied way of war and just how many were actually at the pointy end of fighting. Our support company for this mission includes anti-tank guns, forward observers, mortars, pioneers, and carriers. From reading, I now understand were mostly a sustainment role rather than reconnaissance. Most of these are in the HQ area around Rore, but the carrier platoon are in a dip to the rear. To our right are the neighbouring battalion 11 Durhams, and from 2 Kensingtons we have a platoon of machine guns. We also have 24th Lancers providing defence in depth, so their tanks will be sent to tackle any tanks that break through our line. Lastly, off-map we have 2 troops of 25-pounders, or 8 guns. We're facing Kampfgruppe Weidinger again. This is likely to be the same mixture of Panzer Grenadiers and tanks, and from German doctrine we can expect them to attempt an infiltration and assault, but more on that later. The ground we're fighting on is mostly open country, which favours us as a defender. As mentioned, to our rear there is a dip where the carriers are currently parked up. Then to our front is the Rauray Spur, or ring contour 110, a slight rise looking down onto Bretteville. This slope leads up to a gap in the bocage, forming a natural breach in our battalion's front. Our mission is to hold our company's positions and prevent enemy attempts to break through to the north. Local counterattacks are to be carried out to ensure no ground is lost, and D Company is in reserve for this purpose. 24th Lancers provide defence in depth and will attack any armour that penetrates the Tyneside Scots defences. I've read Breaking the Panzers as far as the Stand 2, and the impression I get is that the Tyneside Scots took over reasonably good positions. Apart from wanting to resight their AT guns, they don't seem to need, want, or be able to massively change where they're deployed. From the description, I'm expecting the Germans to infiltrate their infantry as far up the hill as possible, then assault through the gap between A and B companies. I'm not going to change the defensive layout from the historic one, so this only really leaves me to think about possible counterattack options and what to do when the tanks of the 24th Lancers arrive to push back German armour. The spur is our main line of defence, firing down into the enemy assault. If they get through, there is a slight dip in the land into which they may drop down out of our line of sight. On our right-hand flank we don't have a great deal of options. This line here provides a nice thick barrier for us to get behind and put flanking shots onto Panzers as they pass through D Company's shell scrapes. And the dip itself may provide hull-down positions, though this is likely to be head-on, so is not as advantageous as it might first seem. To our front right, this field to C Company's right may offer some flanking fire onto passing tanks, but it requires engineering work to allow access to tanks. Rauray itself also offers lots of keyholes and high hedges or walls from which to shoot the flanks of tanks. Finally, as a last-ditch option, this orchard may offer some flanking fire, but again requires engineers' support to allow tank access. So my only move for the first turn will really be to rush pioneers into action, preparing those defensive points. first light of a fine summer's day is now given an unusually dull cast as a wave of smoke is laid down by the enemy in an attempt to mask his attacking forces as they line up for action. A message from C Company gives the first serious warning of what is to come. Major Angus reports that the enemy are peppering the company's positions with mortar bombs, and machine gun fire is coming in thick and fast. The artillery is informed of this intensification, and 4 miles back from the front, the 25-pounders make their preparations. C Company is the first to report that it is under attack from both tanks and infantry. The enemy, just visible in the dim light of the early morning, is rapidly advancing across the fields from Bretteville, taking full advantage of the cover being provided by the drifting smoke screen and artillery barrage. After C Company's call, B Company, under the command of Captain Calderwood, reports that the enemy is in its position. The Panzers have continued their advance past C Company and are now entering the area within Ring Contour 110. To our rear, heavy mortar fire falls on Battalion HQ. Luckily, the woods on the edge of the village receive most of it, and the HQ fortunately avoids being wiped out, having been moved from this position during the night. B Company reports that 5 tanks and a company of infantry are attacking it. The men on the edge of Ring Contour 110 are firing non-stop in a frantic attempt to withstand the enemy's onslaught. Barely any time has elapsed since the first reports of an enemy attack, but in that brief time, the frontline troops of the 1st Tyneside Scottish have been severely mauled. Artillery fire from both sides has been colossal, however the enemy has not managed with their first effort to achieve their primary objective of bursting right through the British front. Although hard pressed by the tanks, B Company are putting up a spirited fight. One of the Tyneside Scottish AT guns is pitching everything against the tanks, which are being engaged in turn as they come into range. One big advantage on the side of the defenders is now beginning to tell. The artillery appears to be finding the range of its targets, having had considerable success in dispersing enemy armoured fighting vehicles and infantry. B Company, however, is at risk of being surrounded, and with severe losses is becoming combat ineffective, so make the decision to withdraw. Not long after this decision, we get new sound contacts in the area of Bretteville and to the left-hand edge, which resolve themselves to a second wave of tanks and infantry. This sighting is reported by Captain Mireles of A Company, who calls for urgent assistance. The German attack reaches A Company's position a little time after B and C were hit, and the charge on the 5-sided field is equally savage. Lying as it does alongside the road which is being used as the main thrust, A Company's position is probably one of the hottest places in Normandy at the moment, and it will take some extremely brave support from the Shermans, the 24th Lancers, on the eastern side of Rory village, if some of the Panzers supporting the main drive are to be held off from breaking through and fanning out across the open fields. The 24th Lancers have moved across to the orchard about 500 yards behind A Company's positions. Their job will be to stop the Panzers from advancing beyond the 5-sided field. From the hedges here, it is possible to fire forward about 800 to 1,000 yards, straight at the gap between A and B Companies, where the enemy's tanks are attempting to break through. With this being a head-on position, however, I decided I want to push half of my tanks across the field to A Company to try and get some flanking fire onto the Germans. For the men of D Company sheltered in their slit trenches positioned in the field immediately in front, the deafening report of the salvo of fire from the Lancers is shatteringly loud. Over on the right, the Durhams encountered Germans infiltrating through the fields. I try to move a section forward to catch them in the open, but they in turn are wiped out. So instead I rush 2 of the carrier sections over to the right, with one pushing to the right hand side of the road through fields cleared by engineers, and one pushing to the left. 2 of the carriers are eventually shuffled onto the road, where they can shoot straight down, and with the addition of a forward observer calling in a light harassing mortar mission, we make short work of the infiltration. Over in the centre, as if B Company's problems were not deep enough, a second attack is now underway. Once more, infantry and armoured fighting vehicles are advancing across from Bretteville. This attack cuts between B and C Companies, and C Company's situation, although not altogether clear-cut, is starting to look pretty hopeless. The two left-hand platoons of C Company appear to be completely cut off and are judged to have been overrun. Major Angus and the remains of C Company have been fully stretched for the last few turns, now compelled to give ground to their assailants, and HQ gives Angus permission to fall back and form a link with the Durhams immediately behind. This he does, and his group establishes a firm base on the southern side of an orchard on the edge of Rare village. We also shift the remaining tanks from 24th Lancers over from the left into Rare and prepared positions to the right of C Company. They manage to get some flanking fire onto the Panthers as they move towards Rare, but in many cases the armour just shrugs off the hits. We're really starting to get squeezed here, and so we pull back all of the infantry and tanks into Rare in a last-ditch attempt to keep the Germans from reaching our headquarters. By our fingernails we just managed to hold on, and with an assault gun knocked out in the centre, and a Piat managing to push back a Panther, we reached close to the battle, and a draw. Now this battle was surprisingly easy to narrate, and really catches the point I wanted to make looking at these scenarios. And there's a straightforward reason for this. The designer has meticulously crafted the scenario to capture the events, and most of what I've said is directly from the book. History often casts a critical eye, judging actions with the benefit of hindsight, and it comes up in the book that the Tyneside Scots received some criticism for their performance. Yet with no prior knowledge of the battle, I instinctively made the same calls. The decisions they made might have been the best ones they could have, given the limited information they had at the time. Early in the battle, the Germans seemed to run into similar problems to real life, struggling to identify British positions, possibly even hampered by their own smoke. And just like in the book, my AT guns punished the German armour, firing until they themselves were either knocked out or out of ammunition. In one case, the game designer even seems to have matched a problem one gun team had when the crew realised their barrel couldn't clear the bun to their front or fire into advancing tanks. In real life, they bravely shifted the gun forward under mortar and shell fire. The two carriers rushed to support the Durhams on the Bocage Road also happened, and with A Company taking a hammering in the five-sided field, I was also left with no choice other than to hide them in their shell scrapes. The TAC AI even took the choice out of my hands, with overwhelmed troops falling back under withering fire. My initial plan to use the positions on my right quickly got dropped as it became clear the Germans would mainly be pushing for the gap between A and B companies. I probably could have held my tanks back here like they did in real life, and probably should have, given the situation for A company was realistically unclear, but I desperately wanted to relieve them and get flanking fire onto the Germans in the gap. In real life, tanks also set up in this field, allowing them to fire onto B company's old positions. During the second attack, B company reported that 7 enemy armoured fighting vehicles were 300 yards northeast of Ring Contour 110, and the 24th Lancers responded to this immediately, their Shermans having covered this area previously. The characteristic calm voices of the British tank commanders sent their troops into action with well-polished efficiency, and once more the enemy was prevented from breaking through the gap in the bocage. Lush leafy midsummer vegetation made the observation of groups of infiltrating Germans extremely difficult, but conversely it also helped to hide the 49th Division's armour, making it a little easier for the 24th Lancers to defend Raro. In one example, Lance Sergeant W. Wilcock, a 24th Lancer troop sergeant from C Squadron, managed to slowly creep his Sherman away from the safety of the orchards and reach a point out in the open from where he could observe German tanks forming up for their attack. Once those tanks were fully committed to their attack, he called up the rest of his troop, and they all managed to get a furious 30-second burst of fire onto the enemy. They then returned to their original positions behind the cover of smoke before the enemy's tanks could get a fix on them. Wilcox stayed put, however. To remain in an exposed position like this takes a great deal of coolness and patience, and one mistake could have left him a sitting target. Skimming over my notes and comparing with the book, it appears I only covered 2 of the 4 attacks that actually occurred. The real battle raged all day, with the British finally breaking the Germans at 4:05. This scenario likely captures that moment where the tide turned for the British. Despite being surrounded, pinned down by enemy fire, and having just endured the second wave of attacks, they went on to win the day. Despite closely matching decisions, I did not push D Company forward to reinforce B Company's lines within the playtime. Additionally, the scenario closes before the British bring their monumental firepower to bear, pasting the Germans with mortars, artillery, and even naval guns. Despite these omissions, the scenario effectively portrays the tenacity of the Tyneside Scots, who fought bravely through the chaos. The day culminated with Churchill flamethrower tanks eliminating lingering German forces, allowing the Tyneside Scots and Durhams to restore their positions by 11 p.m. The attack on Rare Gap had been the Germans' best and last chance to penetrate and drive a wedge into the Allied front while they still had panzer divisions fresh enough to attempt it. At the end of the war, Dempsey told Montgomery that he looked on the Rare battle as the turning point of the Normandy campaign. It was the start of the German collapse there.